candle went out just as footsteps stopped outside her door. Eliza Whitmore did not move. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sound of her stepmother's slippers on the wooden floor of the hallway. The footsteps paused, then continued toward the stairs. Only when the sound faded completely did Eliza let out the breath she had been holding. This was her life now, a life of listening, a life of waiting for silence before she dared to move, to speak, to breathe freely. 3 years had passed since her father died, and in those 3 years, Eliza had learned every creak of Ravenswick Manor's floorboards. Every hour her stepmother, Margaret Whitmore, liked to walk the halls checking that doors were shut, and daughters were where they belonged. Eliza's door was always shut. She had learned to make sure of it herself, long before Margaret ever needed to remind her. She rose from the bed and crossed to the small window of her room, the one that looked out over the east garden. The glass was old and slightly warped, so that the moonlight bent strangely across the floor. Eliza pressed her palm against the cold pane and watched the shapes of the hedges below, black against the silver grass. It was the only view she had left of the world. She was not permitted the front windows, which looked out over the drive, where carriages sometimes came and went, where she might have seen a face that was not her stepmother's or the housekeeper's. Downstairs she could hear laughter. Margaret's daughter Charlotte was practicing dance steps in the drawing room, her slippered feet tapping against the polished floor while a visiting dance master called out counts. Eliza had heard those same steps drilled every evening this week. There was a ball coming, the Hartfield Assembly, and Charlotte was to be presented properly, in a new gown of pale blue silk that had arrived from London only 2 days before. No one had mentioned a gown for Eliza. No one ever did. She was 20 years old, and she had not attended a single dance, dinner, or public gathering since her father's funeral. Margaret had explained it to the neighbors so many times that the story had become truth in the county, repeated at tea tables and in letters between families who had never actually laid eyes on Eliza Whitmore to confirm it themselves. "The poor girl suffers from her nerves," Margaret would say, touching a gloved hand to her own collarbone as if the mere mention of Eliza's condition pained her personally. "It would not do to expose her to excitement. Her constitution simply cannot bear it." It was, of course, a complete fabrication. Eliza's constitution was perfectly sound. She could walk for hours in the garden without tiring. She could read late into the night by candlelight and rise early enough to watch the sun come up over the eastern fields. There was nothing wrong with her nerves, her health, or her mind. There was only Margaret's determination that Eliza should never be seen, never be courted, never be given the chance to remind the county that Ravenswick Manor, and everything on it, had belonged to Eliza's father, and by rights, much of it now belonged to Eliza. She turned from the window and lit a fresh candle from the tinderbox on her dresser, her hands steady from long practice. In the mirror above the dresser, her reflection looked back at her, pale and quiet, brown hair pulled into a simple knot, wearing a gray dress that had once belonged to a cousin twice her size, and had been taken in without much care for the fit. It was not the dress of a lady with an inheritance. It was the dress of someone meant to be forgotten. A knock came at the door, sharp and businesslike. Eliza knew it before it opened. Only one person in the house knocked like that, as though she expected the room behind the door to obey her before she even entered. Margaret stepped inside without waiting for a reply. She was a tall woman, elegant in a way that seemed to require constant effort, her dark hair perfectly arranged even at this late hour, her expression composed into the particular blend of concern and control she wore whenever she visited Eliza's room. "You are still awake," Margaret said, though it was not truly a question. "Yes," Eliza answered. "You should rest. Late hours do not agree with your nerves." Margaret's gaze swept the small room, taking in the single candle, the narrow bed, the modest dresser, as though checking that nothing had changed since her last inspection. "I have told Mrs. Dobbins that your supper tray is to come earlier from now on. There is no reason for you to sit up so long." "I am not tired," Eliza said quietly. Margaret's mouth curved, not quite a smile. That is exactly the sort of thing a person says when they do not understand their own condition. "You were always delicate, even as a child. Your father indulged you too much. He let you believe you were stronger than you are." Eliza said nothing. She had learned, in 3 years, that arguing only lengthened these visits and sharpened Margaret's tongue afterward. Silence was safer. Silence was, in fact, the only weapon she had left, and she used it the way a soldier might use the last standing wall of a ruined fort, not because it offered real protection, but because it was all that remained. "Charlotte is doing wonderfully with her dancing," Margaret continued, moving toward the window Eliza had just left, glancing out at the dark garden with faint distaste, as if even the shape of the hedges offended her. "The Hartfield Assembly will be a triumph for her. Colonel Pierce has already expressed an interest in an introduction. A colonel, Eliza, a man of real standing. I am glad for her, Eliza said, and meant it, in a strange, tired way. Charlotte was not unkind, only oblivious, raised since childhood to believe that Eliza's absence from every gathering was simply how things were, an unquestioned fact of the household, like the color of the drawing-room curtains. You could be glad for yourself as well, if you would only trust my judgment in these matters. Margaret turned from the window, and for a moment, something sharper flickered behind her composed expression, something Eliza recognized as the true feeling beneath the concerned mask. I only want what is best for this family, for all of us. For all of us. Eliza had heard that phrase 100 times, and she had come to understand, slowly and painfully, that it meant something quite different than it sounded. It meant what was best for Margaret and Charlotte. It meant that Eliza's silence, her invisibility, her absence from every guest list and every dance floor, served a purpose that had nothing to do with her nerves, and everything to do with what Margaret stood to lose, if the county ever looked closely at Eliza Whitmore and asked the obvious question, why does the true heiress of Ravenswick never leave the house? Good night, Margaret, Eliza said, when the silence had stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Margaret studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, satisfied by whatever she saw, or did not see, in Eliza's carefully blank face. Good night, sleep well. Mrs. Dobbins will bring your tray at 8. The door closed. Eliza listened to the footsteps recede down the hallway, down the stairs, back toward the warm glow and laughter of the drawing room, where Charlotte's dance steps had resumed, light and eager, a girl practicing for a future that was entirely hers to walk into. Eliza blew out the candle and returned to the window. Below, the garden lay silent and silver under the moon, the same garden she had walked every day for 3 years, memorizing its paths the way another young woman might memorize the streets of London, or the halls of a great house at a ball. It was overgrown in places, the roses climbing wild along the southern wall where the gardener no longer bothered to prune, since no guests ever walked that far from the house to see it. Eliza did not mind the wildness. She had come to prefer it, in fact, to the manicured perfection of the front lawns, which existed only for visitors who never came to see her. Tomorrow she would walk there again, as she did every morning while Margaret slept late and Charlotte took her breakfast in bed. It was the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to Eliza, unwatched, unquestioned, hers alone. She lived for that hour the way other people lived for holidays or letters from someone they loved. She did not know, as she finally lay down and closed her eyes, that the world was about to arrive at her garden wall in the most unexpected way imaginable, that the quiet, careful life she had built out of silence and stolen hours was about to be shaken loose from its foundations by a stranger she had never met and could not yet imagine. She only knew that morning was coming, and with it, her hour in the garden. She fell asleep to the sound of Charlotte's dancing feet growing fainter below, and did not stir again until dawn touched the warped glass of her window and turned the bent moonlight into ordinary, golden light. The next morning came gray and cool, with a mist low over the fields that had not yet burned off by the time Eliza slipped out through the side door near the kitchens, the one Mrs. Dobbins always left unbolted for her, a small act of quiet kindness in a house that offered so few. She walked quickly across the damp grass, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, until she reached the wild southern wall, where the roses grew thick and unruly, and the world outside felt, for 1 hour, impossibly far away. She did not know yet that today would be different from every other morning that had come before it. She only knew the familiar comfort of the path beneath her feet, the smell of wet earth and climbing roses, the particular quality of silence that belonged only to her. It was in that silence, as she knelt to examine a rosebush that had begun to lean dangerously against the old stone wall, that she first heard the sound. A low groan, followed by the unmistakable crack of splintering wood, coming from somewhere on the other side of the wall, out on the lane that ran along the eastern boundary of the estate, a lane so rarely used that Eliza had almost forgotten it existed. She rose slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster, and moved toward the sound, drawn by a curiosity 3 years of confinement had not managed to extinguish. Something, or someone, was on the other side of her wall. Eliza glanced back toward the house, at the dark windows still shuttered against the early hour, and felt a strange pull of both fear and hope. Fear, because any disturbance near the estate risked drawing Margaret's attention, and attention was the one thing Eliza could not afford. Hope, because for 3 years nothing unexpected had ever happened to her, nothing at all, and some small, stubborn part of her wanted to know what waited beyond the crumbling stone. The groan came again, weaker this time, followed by the frightened stamping of a horse and the creak of a wheel turning uselessly against a rut in the road. Eliza pressed her hand against the rough stone of the wall and rose onto her toes, trying to see over it, but the wall was too high and too old, built in a time when the family had wanted privacy above all else. She would have to find the gate, the small iron gate half hidden beneath the ivy near the far corner, the one Mrs. Dobbins had once told her was locked so long ago that no one living remembered where the key had gone. Eliza moved toward it anyway, her slippers silent on the wet grass, her heart quickening with something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite fear. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering, just for a moment, what it might be like to jump. The man came over the wall before Eliza had even found the gate. He landed hard on the grass just a few feet from her, stumbling forward with one hand pressed against his ribs and the other still gripping a torn strip of his coat sleeve. For a moment neither of them moved. Eliza stood frozen with her hand still raised toward the ivy she had been pulling back, and the stranger stared at her with an expression of complete astonishment, as though he had expected to find an empty garden and instead found a young woman watching him with wide, startled eyes. "Forgive me," he said, straightening slowly, wincing as he did. "I did not mean to frighten you. My carriage has broken a wheel on the lane, and I am afraid I climbed the wrong wall looking for help." Eliza found her voice after a moment. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride, mostly." He attempted a smile, though it faltered slightly as he shifted his weight. "And perhaps a rib or two, if I am honest. The fall from the carriage was not graceful." He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair disordered from his fall and a coat that, despite its torn sleeve, was clearly expensive, well cut in a way that spoke of London tailors rather than country ones. His boots alone, Eliza noticed, would have cost more than every dress she owned combined, and yet there was mud on his knees and a scrape along his jaw, and he stood in her garden looking entirely unlike the sort of gentleman such boots usually belonged to. "You should not be here," Eliza said, glancing anxiously toward the house. "If anyone sees you, I understand completely, and I will go at once, if you can only point me toward the nearest house where I might find help for my driver and my horses. I would not have troubled you at all, but the lane was empty, and this seemed the nearest place with any sign of life." Eliza hesitated. Sending him away was the safest choice, the choice Margaret would have insisted upon, the choice that avoided every possible complication. But the man was injured, and the nearest house besides Ravenswick itself was nearly 2 miles further along the road, and something in his open, slightly embarrassed manner made her reluctant to simply turn him back over the wall he had just fallen from. "There is a gatehouse," she said finally, the words leaving her before she had fully decided to say them. "Just there, past the old orchard. It has not been used in years, but it is dry, and no one will look for you there. I can bring bandages, and something for the pain." "You would help a stranger who fell into your garden uninvited?" "You did not choose to fall into my garden. Your carriage chose it for you." A small, unfamiliar smile tugged at the corner of Eliza's mouth, the first genuine one in longer than she could easily remember. "Come, quickly, before the household wakes." She led him along the overgrown path behind the rose wall, keeping well clear of the windows that faced the garden, until they reached the small stone gatehouse, half swallowed by ivy at the edge of the orchard. The door stuck when she pushed it, swollen from years of damp, but it gave way after a moment, revealing a single dusty room with a cold hearth and a narrow bench along one wall. "It is not much," Eliza admitted, "but it will keep the rain off, and no one comes here. It is more than enough." He lowered himself carefully onto the bench, one hand still pressed to his side. "I am in your debt, whoever you are. I have not even asked your name." Eliza paused at the door, some old instinct of caution rising in her, the same instinct that had kept her silent through 3 years of Margaret's careful lies. If she gave her true name and this stranger later mentioned it in the village, or worse, at Ravenswick itself, there would be questions she could not answer without inviting exactly the kind of attention she had spent years avoiding. "Eliza," she said finally, offering only that much. "And you?" "Julian," he answered, matching her caution without seeming to notice it, or perhaps noticing it perfectly well and choosing, out of some private reason of his own, to answer in kind. "Julian Ashworth. I am traveling through on business, though at the moment I seem to be doing rather less traveling than intended." "I will bring what you need," Eliza said, and slipped back out into the gray morning before he could ask anything further, before her own careful silence could crack under the weight of a stranger's curious gaze. She returned to the house through the same side door Mrs. Dobbins left unbolted, her mind racing faster than her feet, already calculating what she could take without notice. Bandages from the linen closet on the second floor, which Margaret rarely visited. A small bottle of the pain draft the physician had left for Charlotte's headaches, tucked at the back of a cabinet in the still room. Bread and cheese from the kitchen, easily explained as her own early breakfast, since no one paid close enough attention to what Eliza ate to notice a small increase. Mrs. Dobbins found her in the still room, wrapping bandages into a cloth bundle with hands that trembled slightly from nerves and excitement in equal measure. "Miss Eliza," the older woman's voice was low, careful, the voice of someone who had learned long ago to speak quietly in this house. "What are you about so early?" Eliza considered lying, and then considered that Mrs. Dobbins had been the one kindness in 3 years of confinement, the one person in the household who left doors unbolted and trays a little fuller than instructed, and never once reported Eliza's small movements to Margaret. She deserved better than a lie. "There has been an accident on the Eastern Lane," Eliza said quietly. "A gentleman's carriage. He is hurt, not badly, but hurt, and I have put him in the old gatehouse until he can send for help." Mrs. Dobbins's eyes widened, then narrowed with quick understanding, and something that might almost have been approval. "Does the mistress know?" "No, and she must not yet. If she learns a gentleman has been on the grounds, she will have questions, and I do not know what he might say to answer them, or what she might do to make certain he says nothing at all." Eliza met the housekeeper's eyes steadily. "I am asking you to say nothing, Mrs. Dobbins. I know it is a great deal to ask." For a long moment, the older woman said nothing at all, studying Eliza's face with an expression Eliza could not quite read. Then she reached past her and took a second cloth from the shelf, folding it with quick, practiced hands. "You will need clean water as well, and something for the fever, if a fever comes. Go on, quickly, before the house stirs. I will bring more bandages to the gatehouse myself this evening, once the mistress has retired." Relief flooded through Eliza so suddenly that her eyes stung. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet, child. Thank me if we are not both caught." But there was something almost like warmth in the housekeeper's weathered face as she said it, and Eliza understood, not for the first time, that Mrs. Dobbins's quiet loyalty had never truly belonged to Margaret, whatever wages the mistress of the house paid her. By the time Eliza returned to the gatehouse, the morning mist had begun to burn away, and golden light slanted through the gaps in the old shutters, falling across Julian where he sat exactly as she had left him, his coat now removed and folded beside him, revealing a shirt stained faintly at the ribs where a bruise was already beginning to darken beneath the fabric. "You came back," he said, and there was something in his voice, some quiet surprise, that told her he had half expected she would not. "I said I would." Eliza knelt beside him and began unwrapping the bandages, her hands steadier now that she had a task to focus on. "This may hurt a little. I am not a physician, only someone who has read a great many books on the subject, out of necessity rather than choice." Out of necessity. That sounds like a story. It is not an interesting one. Eliza kept her eyes on the bandages, avoiding his gaze, though she could feel it resting on her, curious and warm. "There was no physician often available when I needed one, so I learned to manage on my own, that is all. I find that difficult to believe. A young lady of your evident refinement, learning medicine out of necessity, hiding an injured stranger in a gatehouse without a moment's hesitation, and asking her household to keep the secret. That is not nothing, Eliza. That is a young woman with a great deal more happening in her life than she is telling me." Eliza's hands stilled for just a moment before she resumed her work, wrapping the bandage carefully around his ribs. "Everyone has more happening than they tell strangers they meet by chance in a garden. Fair enough?" He watched her work in silence for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened, lost some of its earlier polish, as though he too were choosing his words more carefully than a man simply passing through on business might need to. "Then let me ask only this. Are you well, Eliza? Truly well? Because forgive me for saying so, but you moved through that garden like someone accustomed to hiding, and you flinched at the mention of your own household discovering me in a way that suggested more than ordinary propriety." The question landed closer to the truth than Eliza had expected, closer than she was prepared to answer, and for a moment she said nothing at all, focusing entirely on tying off the bandage with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. "I am quite well," she said finally, too quickly, and heard in her own voice exactly how little the words convinced even herself. Julian did not press further, though something in his expression told her the answer had not satisfied him, that he had noted the too quick reply and filed it away for later, the way a man accustomed to negotiations and careful observation might note an opponent's tell without immediately acting on it. "Then I will simply say thank you," he said instead, gently, for your kindness to a stranger who fell over your wall uninvited. Whatever brought you to that garden this morning, Eliza, I am grateful for it." Outside, a bird began to sing somewhere in the old orchard, and the golden morning light crept further across the dusty floor of the gatehouse, and Eliza, finishing her work and rising to leave before the household woke fully around her, found herself, for the first time in 3 years, reluctant to return to the silence of her own small room. She did not know, as she slipped back through the garden toward the house, that the stranger she had just bandaged and hidden away was no traveling gentleman of modest means, but the Duke of Ravendale himself, one of the most sought-after men in England, traveling under a borrowed name for reasons entirely his own. She only knew that something had shifted in the quiet architecture of her days. Some small crack of light let in through a wall she had thought entirely sealed, and that she found herself already thinking of the hour tomorrow morning when she might return to the gatehouse again. The rest of that day passed for Eliza in a strange, doubled fashion, as though she were living 2 separate lives at once. On the surface, everything continued exactly as it always had. She took her breakfast alone in her room, as she did every morning, the tray brought up by a younger maid who never lingered long enough for conversation. She sat through an hour of needlework in the small parlor set aside for her use, a room Margaret had chosen specifically because its single window faced the kitchen garden rather than the drive, so that Eliza would have nothing more interesting to look at than cabbages while she stitched. She listened, from behind her closed door, to the sounds of Charlotte's afternoon lessons in French, and to Margaret's voice rising and falling in the hallway as she discussed the details of the coming assembly with the housekeeper, arrangements for carriages and flowers, and the particular shade of ribbon Charlotte's maid was to use in her hair. But beneath that surface, Eliza's thoughts kept returning, again and again, to the gatehouse at the edge of the orchard, and to the stranger sitting there with his ribs bound in bandages she herself had wrapped. She found herself remembering small details with unusual clarity, the particular warmth in his voice when he had thanked her, the careful way he had avoided pressing her further after her too quick answer about being well, the torn sleeve of an obviously expensive coat that suggested a man of means traveling in circumstances that did not match his usual life. She wondered who Julian Ashworth truly was, and why a gentleman of evident wealth was traveling alone on a nearly abandoned lane, without even a proper driver to see to his carriage's repair. She wondered whether he had a family waiting for him somewhere, a wife perhaps, or a mother who would worry when he did not arrive as expected. The thought of a wife brought an odd, unfamiliar pang that Eliza did not examine too closely, telling herself instead that her concern was simply the natural worry of anyone who had helped a stranger and wished to see him safely on his way. That evening, once the house had settled into its usual quiet and Margaret had retired to her rooms after a final round of instructions to the staff, Mrs. Dobbins found Eliza in the small parlor and pressed a folded note into her hand without a word, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes held a glint of something that might have been quiet amusement at the whole secretive business. Eliza waited until she was alone in her room, the door shut and the candle lit, before she unfolded the note. The handwriting was elegant, confident, clearly the hand of a man well educated and accustomed to writing a great deal. "I find myself in your debt twice over now," it read. "Once for your kindness this morning, and once again for the excellent bread and cheese, which I am ashamed to admit I finished entirely before noon. My driver reports the wheel can be repaired by tomorrow evening, which means I remain, for one more day at least, an uninvited guest upon your family's land. I hope this does not trouble you unduly. If it would not be too great an imposition, I would very much welcome the chance to properly thank the person who saved a foolish traveler from spending the night in a ditch." Eliza read the note twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it beneath the loose floorboard beside her bed, where she kept the few small things she owned that were entirely her own. A pressed flower from her mother's funeral wreath, a locket with no picture inside it, a handful of letters from her father written before his final illness. It felt strange and a little dangerous to add a stranger's note to that private collection, but she found she could not bring herself to burn it, as caution surely demanded. Tomorrow morning, she decided, she would return to the gatehouse one final time, if only to see him safely on his way, and to satisfy the small, persistent curiosity that had followed her through the entire long day, like a shadow she could not quite outrun. Margaret Whitmore's hand froze over her teacup the moment the footman announced the name at her own front door. "The Duke of Ravendale," the footman repeated, as though he could hardly believe the words himself, "requests the pleasure of calling upon the household, having heard of its excellent reputation in the county." For a woman who prided herself on never being caught unprepared, Margaret took a full 3 seconds to recover, setting down her cup with exaggerated care, while her mind raced through every possible reason a duke, and not merely any duke but the most talked about and least seen duke in England, might suddenly appear at Ravenswick's door. She had heard the name Ravendale mentioned at every dinner party for the past 2 seasons, always with the same breathless speculation. He kept almost entirely to his own estates, refused most invitations, and had not, according to reliable gossip, so much as danced with a single young lady at any London event in nearly 3 years. And yet here he stood, apparently, on her own front step. "Show him in at once," Margaret said, already rising and smoothing her skirts, already calculating. "And send for Charlotte. Tell her to change into the green muslin, quickly." She had no way of knowing, as she hurried to compose herself in the entrance hall, that the Duke of Ravendale calling at her door had very little to do with any interest in Charlotte, and a great deal to do with a garden wall, a broken carriage wheel, and a young woman who had introduced herself only by her first name 2 mornings before. Julian Ashworth, now dressed properly as himself for the first time since his accident, his ribs still faintly sore beneath a well-tailored coat, stepped into the drawing-room of Ravenswick Manor, with the practiced composure of a man who had spent a lifetime being watched, assessed, and courted, and who had long ago learned to give nothing away in his expression that he did not intend to give. "Your Grace," Margaret dropped into a curtsy so deep it seemed almost theatrical, and when she rose, her smile had achieved exactly the right measure of warmth, without appearing eager. "What an unexpected honor. I confess I did not know you were in the county." "A carriage accident unfortunately delayed my journey," Julian said smoothly, taking the seat she offered near the window. "I found myself unexpectedly grounded on the Eastern Lane for 2 days while repairs were made. I did not wish to leave the area without paying my respects to the family whose land I so inconveniently trespassed upon." "Trespassed, Your Grace? I assure you, any land of ours is entirely at your disposal." Margaret's eyes flicked briefly, involuntarily, toward the window facing the eastern boundary, as though trying to calculate exactly how close his accident had brought him to something she would rather he not have seen. "I do hope you were not injured." "A few bruises, nothing more. I was fortunate that someone from your household happened upon me quickly, and saw to my care." He watched her carefully as he said it, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, the small pause before she answered. "How fortunate indeed. One of the staff, I imagine. I shall have to reward them properly." Margaret's smile did not waver, but her hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ravenswick keeps an excellent household, if I do say so myself." Charlotte arrived at that moment, breathless and pink-cheeked from a hurried change of dress, and the conversation shifted easily into the sort of pleasant, unremarkable exchange Julian had endured 100 times before. Questions about his journey, comments on the fine weather, careful hints dropped about the upcoming Hartfield assembly, and how delighted the family would be if His Grace happened to find himself free that evening. Julian answered every question with practiced ease, smiling at the right moments, complimenting Charlotte's playing when she was persuaded to demonstrate a piece on the pianoforte, all the while turning over, quietly and methodically, the single detail that had brought him to this house in the first place. Someone from the household had saved him, a young woman named Eliza, who moved through her own garden like a person accustomed to hiding, who had flinched at the thought of discovery, who had answered his question about her well-being too quickly and too unconvincingly to be entirely true. And in an hour of conversation with the mistress of this house and her charming, chattering daughter, that name had not once been mentioned. "You have a lovely home," Julian said, when a natural pause presented itself. "Do you have a large family, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I confess I know very little about the household beyond your own reputation and your daughter's, which I understand precedes her rather favorably this season." Something flickered across Margaret's face, there and gone so quickly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. "Only Charlotte, Your Grace, and my late husband's daughter from his first marriage, though she does not go about in society. Her health, unfortunately, has never permitted it." "I am sorry to hear that. What ails her, if I may ask?" "A weakness of the nerves since childhood. The physicians have never been able to offer much improvement, I am afraid, and we have found it kindest simply to keep her from the strain of excitement and society." Margaret delivered the explanation with the smooth, practiced ease of something recited many times before, and Julian, who had spent a full morning in the company of a young woman with steady hands, clear eyes, and a mind sharp enough to have bandaged a stranger's ribs with genuine skill, found himself struggling to reconcile the description with what he had actually witnessed. "That is unfortunate," he said carefully. "I hope she is comfortable at least." "Entirely comfortable, Your Grace. We want for nothing in her care." Margaret's smile returned, brittle at the edges now, though she smoothed it quickly. But I am certain such matters cannot interest a man of your position. Tell me, will we have the pleasure of your company at the Hartfield Assembly this evening? Colonel Pierce will be attending, and I understand several other distinguished families as well." Julian allowed the subject to be changed, giving Margaret exactly the impression she wanted, that of a mildly curious guest who had asked a polite question and accepted a polite answer without further thought. But as he made his farewells a short while later, promising to consider the assembly and thanking Margaret again for her hospitality, his mind had already fixed on a single, unshakable conclusion. Whoever Eliza truly was, she was not a girl too weak of nerve to leave her room. And whatever kept her hidden from society had very little to do with her health, and a great deal to do with something Margaret Whitmore was determined that no one, least of all a duke with the power and connections to ask questions no one else dared ask, should ever discover. He did not return directly to the inn where he had taken rooms while his carriage was repaired. Instead, he walked the long way around the estate's boundary, along the eastern lane where his accident had occurred, until he reached the old gatehouse at the edge of the orchard, half hoping, half expecting to find it empty, since Eliza had promised only to see him settled and had made no arrangement to return once his carriage was mended. She was there anyway, sitting on the narrow bench with a book open on her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the door, as though she had been listening for footsteps for some time. "You came," she said, closing the book quickly, a faint flush rising to her cheeks at having been caught waiting. "I did." Julian sat beside her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to remain entirely proper. "I have just come from taking tea with your family, Eliza." Her face went very still. "My family, Mrs. Whitmore, and a young lady named Charlotte, who plays the pianoforte quite well, though she is rather more interested in whether Colonel Pierce will find her handkerchief embroidery impressive than in the music itself." He watched her carefully as he spoke, noting the way her hands had gone tight around the closed book, the way her breath had caught and held. "Your stepmother tells me she has a stepdaughter who suffers from a weakness of the nerves. She did not mention your name. She did not seem inclined to discuss you at all, in fact, beyond the barest necessary explanation for your absence." "You know who I am," Eliza said softly, and it was not quite a question. "I know you are the young woman who bandaged my ribs with the skill of someone who has done it before, out of necessity, as you told me yourself. I know you moved through your own garden as though you expected to be caught at any moment, and that you begged your housekeeper to keep my presence a secret, with a fear I do not believe a healthy young lady, comfortably cared for by a devoted family, would ever have reason to feel." He turned to face her fully now, his voice gentle but direct. "I do not think you suffer from weak nerves, Eliza. I think you have been very carefully hidden, for reasons I do not yet understand, and I find that I cannot simply take my leave and forget what I have seen." Eliza's eyes filled suddenly, unexpectedly. With tears she fought hard to blink away. 3 years of carefully guarded silence, threatening to crack open all at once in front of a man she had known for barely 2 days. "You should not concern yourself with it. It is not your affair, and there is nothing to be done regardless. Margaret controls the household, the accounts, everything my father left behind, at least until certain matters are settled, and she has made very certain that no one who might question her arrangements ever has the opportunity to look closely enough to do so." "What matters are being settled?" "My father's estate," Eliza said, and once the first words came, the rest followed in a rush she seemed unable to stop, as though a dam long straining under pressure had finally given way. "He died 3 years ago and left provisions for me, a proper inheritance, meant to come to me fully at 21, along with guardianship arrangements that were meant to protect my interests until then. Margaret was named as guardian, temporarily, until the solicitors could complete the transfer. That transfer has never happened. There have been delays, difficulties with the paperwork, complications she assures the solicitors are being addressed. I do not see the letters myself. I am not permitted access to my father's correspondence, or to the family accounts, or to nearly anything that might tell me the truth of what is actually happening to what he left me." Julian listened in silence, his expression darkening with each detail, the careless polish of the drawing room entirely gone now, replaced by something sharper, more focused. "How much longer until you turn 21? 4 months, Eliza whispered. "If I live that long without Margaret finding some new reason to delay the transfer further, or some way to ensure I never come into it at all." The words hung in the small, dusty room, and outside, the orchard rustled faintly in a rising wind, and Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravendale, a man who had spent years avoiding entanglements, avoiding scandal, avoiding precisely the sort of complicated, dangerous family drama that now sat unfolding before him in the person of a frightened, remarkable young woman, found that he had already, without quite deciding to, made up his mind to help her. 4 months, he repeated quietly. Then we have 4 months to make certain your stepmother does not succeed. You do not even know the whole of it, Eliza said, wiping quickly at her eyes, ashamed of the tears despite everything. There is more. My father's solicitor, a Mr. Edmund Carow in London, wrote to me directly once, a year ago, a letter Margaret did not manage to intercept in time. He said he had grown concerned about certain irregularities in the accounts submitted on my behalf, expenses claimed against my inheritance that he could not properly account for, and asked that I confirm, in my own hand, whether I had approved them. I never received the letter he expected in reply, because Margaret found it before I could answer, and after that, my correspondence has been watched far more closely. I do not know if Mr. Carow ever wrote again. I do not know if my silence convinced him the irregularities were resolved, or whether he suspects something is deeply wrong and simply lacks the means to act on his suspicion from so great a distance. Then he is precisely the sort of man I ought to speak with, Julian said, already turning the problem over with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to matters of his own estate, a habit of mind that had served him well in every negotiation and dispute he had ever managed, though none, he thought, had ever mattered quite so much as this one. A solicitor with genuine concerns about irregularities in an estate's accounts is not a man who will simply let the matter drop, whatever silence has followed. He will have kept records. He will have kept copies of his own letters, at the very least, even if yours to him were never sent. You would go to London for this? For me? You do not even know me, Julian. 2 days ago you did not know I existed. 2 days ago, I fell over a garden wall with a broken carriage and 2 cracked ribs, and a young woman I had never met bandaged me with more skill and kindness than I had any right to expect, and then risked her own safety to keep me hidden from a household that, I now understand, would very likely have used my presence against her, had they discovered it first. Julian's voice was steady, certain, entirely without the practiced charm he had used so easily in Margaret's drawing room not an hour before. I have spent a great deal of my life being courted by people who wanted something from my title, my fortune, my name. I have grown rather good at recognizing it, and rather tired of it, if I am honest. You wanted nothing from me, Eliza. You did not even know who I was. That matters to me more than you may understand. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light of the gatehouse, searching perhaps for some sign of the practiced charm she had heard about even in her limited exposure to society gossip carried in second-hand through servants and old newspapers. Some sign that his kindness was simply another version of the performance he had given so effortlessly to Margaret. She found none, only steady, quiet resolve, and something else beneath it that she was not yet ready to name. If Margaret learns you are asking questions, she said finally, she will grow desperate. I do not know what she is capable of when desperate. She has already shown me she is capable of a great deal simply to maintain control. Then we will be careful, Julian said. I will not move against her directly, not yet. Not until I know precisely what Carow's records show, and precisely how deep her irregularities run. In the meantime, I have every reason to remain in this county a while longer. A duke recovering from a carriage accident, taking a polite interest in local society, attending the Hartfield assembly his hostess so eagerly invited him to. No one will think it strange. You would attend the assembly. Something like wonder crossed Eliza's face. Charlotte will be beside herself. Margaret will be insufferable for a week. Let her be insufferable. It will give me a perfectly natural reason to remain near enough to Ravenswick to learn what I need to learn, and to see you, if you will permit it, without raising suspicion. He hesitated, then added, more quietly, that is, if you would welcome my continued presence at all, given everything you have just told me. I would not wish to add to your danger, Eliza, if you would rather I simply take what I have heard and act on it from a safer distance. No, the word came quickly, more certainly than Eliza had expected of herself. No, I do not want a safer distance. I have had 3 years of distance, Julian. I am rather tired of it. A faint smile crossed his face, warm and genuine, entirely unlike the polished expression he had worn in the drawing room. Then we are agreed. I will write to Carow tonight, and I will attend the assembly tomorrow. And you, I hope, will find some way to slip these letters to me when there is news to share, since I do not imagine your stepmother permits you to receive callers of your own. There is a loose stone in the garden wall, just beside the gate. I have hidden things there before, small things. When I needed a place Margaret would never think to search. Eliza glanced toward the door, mindful suddenly of how long she had already been away from the house, of the questions that might arise if her absence stretched too far past its usual hour. I should go. If I am gone much longer, someone will notice, and questions now are the very last thing either of us can afford. Go then, and Eliza. He caught her hand gently as she rose, the touch brief and entirely proper, and yet it seemed to Eliza to carry more warmth than any touch she had felt in 3 long years of careful isolation. Thank you for trusting me with this. I do not take it lightly. She left him there in the fading afternoon light of the gatehouse, and as she made her way back through the orchard toward the house, her mind was no longer occupied with silence and survival alone, but with something new and fragile and entirely unfamiliar, a small, stubborn seed of hope that perhaps, for the first time since her father's death, she was not entirely alone in the fight for what belonged to her. Margaret found the note before Eliza ever reached the loose stone in the garden wall. It happened by pure, terrible chance. A letter had arrived at Ravenswick that morning addressed to Eliza in an unfamiliar hand, and Margaret, who intercepted every piece of correspondence meant for her stepdaughter as a matter of long habit, had opened it in the privacy of her own study before Eliza ever knew it existed. The letter was brief, careful, giving away nothing that named names or explained circumstances directly, exactly as Julian had intended when he wrote it, but it spoke of continued concern, of a solicitor in London making quiet inquiries, of the writer's determination to see certain matters resolved before 4 months had passed. Margaret read it 3 times, her face growing paler and more rigid with each reading, and by the time she finished, her hands were shaking with a fury she had not felt in years. She knew immediately who had written it. There was only one man of consequence who had passed through the county in recent days, only one man whose sudden, unexplained interest in Ravenswick's household could account for a letter this carefully, deliberately vague. The Duke of Ravendale had not simply fallen over her garden wall by accident, as she had allowed herself to believe. He had found something, or someone, in that garden that had turned a mere carriage accident into something far more dangerous. She summoned Eliza to her study within the hour, and when Eliza entered, drawn by unease at the unusual summons, she found Margaret standing rigid behind her desk. The opened letter held out like an accusation. "Would you care to explain this?" Margaret's voice was low, controlled, far more frightening than any raised temper could have been. "A letter, addressed to you, from a man clearly asking questions about matters that are none of his concern. Matters, Eliza, that are entirely the private business of this family." Eliza's stomach dropped, but she kept her face as still as she could manage. 3 years of practice, steadying her voice even as her heart pounded. "I do not know what you mean. Do not lie to me." Margaret crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and for one terrible moment Eliza thought she might strike her, though Margaret had never once, in 3 years, resorted to violence, preferring instead the slower, crueler weapons of confinement and control. "I know you have been meeting someone. I know it is the Duke. I do not know how, or why, or what foolish confidences you have shared with a man you met perhaps twice, but I intend to put an end to it immediately." "You cannot keep me from speaking to whomever I choose," Eliza said, though her voice shook slightly on the words, betraying the fear beneath the defiance. "I can, and I will, for exactly as long as it takes." Margaret's smile was thin and cold. "You forget, my dear, that until you are 21, I remain your legal guardian in every meaningful sense. I decide who you may see, where you may go, what liberties you are permitted. And I have decided, effective immediately, that you are to remain in your room until further notice. Meals will be brought to you. You will not walk in the garden. You will not so much as look out the window facing the eastern wall. Do I make myself entirely clear?" "Margaret, please," I said. "Do I make myself entirely clear?" Eliza said nothing, and her silence was answer enough. Margaret nodded, satisfied, and rang for a maid to escort Eliza back to her room, as though she were no longer trusted to walk the halls of her own family home unattended. The days that followed were the longest of Eliza's confinement. Her door was not locked, not officially, since even Margaret balked at anything so openly cruel that a servant might later be forced to testify to it, but a maid was posted in the hallway at all hours, under strict instruction to report immediately if Eliza attempted to leave. Her meals arrived on trays carried by different servants each time, none of whom lingered long enough for a private word, and even Mrs. Dobbins, when she managed to bring Eliza's supper herself on the 3rd evening, could offer little beyond a sympathetic look and a whispered warning that the mistress had grown watchful of every member of the staff, questioning anyone who had shown Eliza the smallest kindness in recent weeks. "She suspects me," Mrs. Dobbins whispered, setting the tray down with hands that trembled slightly. "I have said nothing, Miss Eliza, I swear it on my life, but she has asked me twice now whether I have seen anything unusual in the garden, and I do not know how much longer I can convince her I have not." You must protect yourself, Mrs. Dobbins. I will not have you lose your position, or worse, on my account. Eliza gripped the older woman's hand tightly. Has there been any word, any message at all? Mrs. Dobbins hesitated, glancing toward the door, then reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small folded paper, pressing it quickly into Eliza's palm, before straightening and resuming her ordinary, businesslike manner, in case anyone should be listening at the door. I found this tucked beneath the stone yesterday morning, before the mistress doubled the watch on the gardens. I do not know how much longer I will be able to reach it again. Eliza waited until she was alone to unfold the note, her hands unsteady with a mixture of hope and dread. I have heard, through channels I would rather not describe in writing, that your movements have been restricted. I will not pretend this does not alarm me. Caro has replied, and his letter confirms what we feared, and more besides. There are discrepancies in the accounts going back nearly 2 years, sums drawn against your inheritance that he cannot trace to any legitimate expense. He is prepared to travel to the county himself if it becomes necessary, but he will need access to certain documents kept at Ravenswick to build a case strong enough to act upon. I do not yet know how we will manage that, given your current circumstances, but I promise you, Eliza, I have not stopped thinking of a way. Hold on. 4 months has become perhaps less, if your stepmother grows desperate enough to act rashly, and desperate people often make the very mistakes that expose them. Trust that I am working toward your freedom every hour I am not with you. J. Eliza read the letter twice, then a third time, memorizing every word before she fed it, with real regret, into the small flame of her bedside candle, watching the paper curl and blacken, and finally crumble to ash, exactly as she had learned to do with every scrap of hope Margaret might have found and used against her. She did not know, sitting alone in her locked-away room with only the ashes of Julian's letter for comfort, that Margaret's desperation had already begun to accelerate matters far more quickly than either she or Julian had anticipated. Downstairs in her study, Margaret had summoned her own solicitor, a man of considerably less scruple than the honest Mr. Caro, and was already drafting arrangements to hasten Charlotte's betrothal to a visiting baron of modest fortune but excellent connections, a match that would, if concluded quickly enough, secure Charlotte's future and, not incidentally, provide Margaret with grounds to argue that the family's finances required continued management under her sole authority for some time yet, regardless of what any inconvenient birthday might otherwise entitle her stepdaughter to claim. It was a desperate plan, hastily conceived, and it would, in the end, prove to be Margaret's undoing. But in the moment, sitting at her desk with the Baron's letter of acceptance already drafted and waiting only for a signature, Margaret Whitmore believed, with the particular confidence of a woman who had gotten away with a great deal for a very long time, that she still held every advantage, and that a locked door and a watchful maid would be more than sufficient to keep one frightened, powerless young woman exactly where she belonged. She had no idea how badly she had underestimated her. The visiting baron arrived at Ravenswick 2 days later, a stout, pleasant-faced man named Baron Coleridge, whose fortune, though respectable, had suffered somewhat under the mismanagement of an elderly uncle from whom he had recently inherited his title, and whose need for a wife with connections and a dowry outweighed, apparently, any particular curiosity about the haste with which Margaret proposed the match. Charlotte, for her part, seemed genuinely delighted by the arrangement, having taken an immediate liking to the Baron's easy manner and ready laughter, and Margaret allowed herself, for the first time in days, a measure of real satisfaction as she watched the two of them stroll the front lawns together, under the careful supervision of a chaperone. It was, Margaret told herself, exactly the sort of triumph the season demanded. A daughter well settled, a title secured for the family name, and a plausible, entirely respectable reason to argue, should anyone ever question her continued management of the estate's finances, that a household in the midst of arranging so significant a match required steady, experienced guidance, rather than the sudden upheaval of transferring control to an inexperienced young woman not yet even of age. She did not know that Baron Coleridge, walking the lawns with Charlotte on his arm, had mentioned, entirely in passing and without any particular malice, that he had dined the previous evening with a gentleman recently arrived in the county, a duke no less, who had asked a great many careful questions about the Whitmore family and its history, questions that had struck the Baron, upon reflection, as rather more pointed than idle curiosity usually produced. Charlotte, delighted simply to have the Baron's attention at all, thought nothing of the remark, and did not think to mention it to her mother. It was Mrs. Dobbins, overhearing the tail end of the conversation while attending to the tea service on the terrace, who carried the detail upstairs that evening, slipping it quietly into her report to Eliza along with the supper tray, her voice low enough that the maid posted in the hallway could not possibly overhear. "The Duke is asking questions of anyone in the county who will answer them," Mrs. Dobbins whispered, setting the tray down with practiced calm. "The Baron mentioned it to Miss Charlotte without a second thought, and Miss Charlotte, bless her, has no notion at all what she overheard means. But the mistress will hear of it eventually, Miss Eliza, whether from the Baron himself or from some other quarter. You must be prepared." "Prepared for what?" Eliza asked, though some cold, certain part of her already suspected the answer. "For her to move faster than she already has. A woman like the mistress, cornered, does not slow down. She quickens." Mrs. Dobbins glanced toward the door, then back at Eliza, her weathered face creased with genuine worry. "I do not know what she intends, but I have served in this house long enough to know the particular look she wears when she believes she is running out of time. She wore it today, at breakfast, when the Baron's letter of acceptance arrived from Miss Charlotte's hand. She wears it now, I would wager, in her study, drafting whatever comes next." Eliza sat very still on the edge of her bed after Mrs. Dobbins had gone, turning the housekeeper's warning over in her mind alongside Julian's last letter. The discrepancies in the accounts, the sums Caro could not trace, the 4 months that had already begun to feel, in the space of a single locked week, like far too long to wait. She thought of her father, of the quiet, patient man who had raised her with such evident love in the years before his final illness, who had trusted his own wife to protect his daughter's inheritance, and had never imagined, perhaps could not have imagined, the particular cruelty with which that trust would eventually be repaid. She thought, too, of Julian, somewhere in the county at that very moment, asking careful questions of barons and solicitors and anyone else who might hold a piece of the truth, working, as he had promised, toward her freedom every hour he was not with her. She did not know precisely what he intended, or how soon it might come, but she found, sitting alone in her locked-away room with the last of her supper growing cold on its tray, that she believed him. She believed, for the first time in 3 long years, that someone outside these walls was fighting for her, and that belief, fragile as it was, gave her the strength to face whatever Margaret's quickening desperation might bring next. She did not have to wait long to find out. Late that night, long after the house had gone quiet and the maid stationed outside her door had finally succumbed to drowsiness in her chair, Eliza rose from her bed and crossed to the window, drawn by a faint, unfamiliar sound from the drive below. She pressed herself carefully against the edge of the glass and looked down to see a carriage she did not recognize standing before the house, its lamps lit against the darkness, and Margaret herself, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak, speaking urgently with a man Eliza had never seen before, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. She could not hear their words from this distance, only the low, hurried rhythm of Margaret's voice and the occasional shorter reply from the stranger, but something about the scene, the lateness of the hour, the secrecy of it, the way Margaret kept glancing back toward the darkened windows of the house as though fearful of being observed, sent a fresh current of unease through Eliza's chest. Whatever business her stepmother conducted in the dead of night with a stranger who arrived and departed without any servant announcing his name, it was not the business of a woman who believed she had nothing to hide. Eliza watched until the carriage pulled away, and Margaret disappeared back inside the house, and then she returned to her bed, though sleep did not come easily. She lay awake turning the strange scene over in her mind, wondering what new scheme her stepmother had set into motion, and praying, with a fervency she had not allowed herself in years, that Julian's careful inquiries would uncover the truth before Margaret's midnight arrangements could do whatever damage they were designed to do. The night before, in a private room at the county's only respectable inn, Julian had sat until well past midnight with Edmund Caro spread across the small table between them, poring over ledgers and letters by the light of 2 guttering candles, piecing together, line by line, the full shape of what Margaret Whitmore had done. "It is worse than I feared when I first wrote to you," Caro admitted, rubbing his tired eyes as he set down yet another page of figures. "The withdrawals began within months of Mr. Whitmore's death, small at first, easily mistaken for ordinary estate expenses, but they grew steadily bolder as the years passed, and no one ever questioned them. She grew confident, Your Grace, confident that no one was watching closely enough to notice, and for 2 years, she was entirely correct. And the guardianship documents? Altered, I am now certain of it, though proving alteration to a magistrate's satisfaction will require comparing the ink in the paper stock to samples from the same period, which I have already arranged to have examined by a specialist in London. But taken together with the intercepted letter and the forged reply, I do not believe any reasonable magistrate will require much further convincing." Carol leaned back in his chair, studying Julian with open curiosity he had so far been too professionally cautious to voice. "May I ask, Your Grace, what precisely drew your attention to this matter in the first place?" I confess it is unusual for a man of your position to take such a personal interest in the affairs of a country solicitor's client. Julian considered the question for a long moment before answering, turning his own memory back to a gray morning garden, a wall he had fallen over quite by accident, and a young woman who had asked nothing of him beyond his name before kneeling to bandage his ribs with more care than most physicians he had known. I met Miss Whitmore under circumstances neither of us planned, he said finally, and I found, in the short time since, that I could not simply walk away from what I learned of her situation and pretend I had seen nothing. Some things, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen again. Caro's expression softened slightly, though he said nothing further on the matter, returning instead to the careful, methodical work of preparing every document, every comparison, every piece of evidence that would be needed the following morning. By the time the candles finally burned down to their stubs and the first gray light of dawn began to touch the inn's small windows, Julian had already sent word to Magistrate Ellery, a man he had met briefly at a London dinner years before and trusted to act with fairness and discretion, requesting his presence at Ravenswick that very morning, before Margaret Whitmore's desperation could produce any further midnight schemes of the sort Eliza had witnessed from her window. The carriage that thundered up Ravenswick's drive the following morning bore the Duke of Ravendale's own crest, and it did not stop at a polite distance, as visiting carriages usually did, but drove directly to the front steps, where Julian descended before the wheels had fully stopped turning, his expression carrying none of the practiced warmth he had shown Margaret at their first meeting. He was not alone. Beside him climbed down a lean, sharp-eyed man in the plain, well-worn coat of a working solicitor, a leather case gripped tightly under one arm, and behind them both, to the utter astonishment of the footman who opened the door, came a third figure entirely unexpected at Ravenswick, a county magistrate whose presence alone was enough to send a ripple of alarm through every servant who witnessed the arrival. "I am here to see Mrs. Whitmore," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the entrance hall as startled servants scattered to fetch the mistress of the house, "and I am afraid this visit cannot wait." Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, already composed, already smiling the careful, welcoming smile she had perfected over years of managing appearances, though Eliza, watching from the landing above where the maid stationed outside her door had momentarily abandoned her post in the general confusion, could see the faint tremor in her stepmother's hands as she descended. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. Had I known you intended to call, I would have—" "I think we are past the point of pleasantries, Mrs. Whitmore." Julian's voice remained level, but there was iron beneath it now, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed and entirely unwilling to be managed. "This is Mr. Edmund Caro, solicitor to the late Mr. Whitmore's estate, who has traveled from London at my request to review certain matters he has found deeply troubling for some time. And this is Magistrate Ellery, who I believe you have met before, at least socially, though I doubt under quite these circumstances." Margaret's smile faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it. "I confess I do not understand what business could possibly require a magistrate's presence in my own home." "Then allow me to explain plainly." Caro stepped forward, opening his leather case with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent a long journey preparing exactly this moment. "I have here copies of the correspondence you submitted to my office over the past 2 years regarding the management of Miss Eliza Whitmore's inheritance. I have also here the original accounts kept in my own office, records of the sums actually due against that inheritance, for legitimate estate expenses. The discrepancy between the two, Mrs. Whitmore, amounts to a considerable sum, drawn from funds that were never yours to claim, disguised across dozens of small, individually unremarkable withdrawals, designed, I believe, to avoid drawing scrutiny to any single transaction." "This is absurd," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have managed this estate faithfully since my husband's death, exactly as his will instructed, and I will not stand accused of theft in my own home by a solicitor I have never met and a duke who fell over my garden wall not a fortnight ago." "You will stand accused of considerably more than theft, I am afraid," Julian said quietly, "once we account for the letter your stepdaughter never received a year ago, the one Mr. Caro sent inquiring whether she had personally approved certain expenses. A letter you intercepted and never forwarded, and to which you then apparently replied yourself, forging her signature well enough to satisfy a solicitor who had no reason at the time to doubt it." The color drained entirely from Margaret's face. "I did not forge anything," she said, but the protest came too quickly, too thin, and every person in the entrance hall, servants included, could hear the lie in it as clearly as if she had confessed outright. "Mr. Caro has retained samples of Eliza's genuine handwriting, provided by her old governess, who kept several of her lesson books from childhood," Julian continued, relentless now. Each fact laid down like another stone in a wall Margaret could no longer climb over. The comparison to the signature on the letter you sent him will not be difficult for a magistrate to evaluate. Nor will the comparison of that same signature to the guardianship documents you have repeatedly cited when questioned about the delay in transferring Eliza's inheritance. Documents Mr. Caro now believes were altered after your husband's death to extend your authority well beyond what his original will actually provided. Eliza, watching from the landing above, felt her breath catch entirely as 3 years of carefully constructed lies collapsed in the space of a few devastating minutes. She descended the stairs slowly, drawn by a need to witness this moment fully, to see with her own eyes the truth finally spoken aloud in the very house where it had been buried for so long. Eliza. Margaret turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for the first time in 3 years, Eliza saw something in her stepmother's expression that was not composed calculation, but genuine, unguarded fear. Eliza, you must understand, everything I did to protect this family, to protect Charlotte's future. You did it to protect yourself, Eliza said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly across the hall, steady in a way that surprised even her. You locked me away for 3 years, told the entire county I was too weak of nerve to be seen, kept me from every friend, every suitor, every ordinary joy of being young, so that no one would ever look closely enough to ask why the true heiress of this estate lived like a prisoner in her own home. It was not like that. It was exactly like that. Julian's voice cut in, quiet but final, and I believe Magistrate Ellery has heard quite enough to determine what happens next. The magistrate, who had remained largely silent through the exchange, stepped forward now with the grave, measured authority of his office. Mrs. Whitmore, given the evidence presented, I am obligated to open a formal inquiry into the management of the Whitmore estate and the guardianship arrangements concerning Miss Eliza Whitmore. Until that inquiry is concluded, all authority over the estate's finances and over Miss Whitmore's personal affairs will be suspended and transferred to independent oversight, pending review by the court. I would also strongly advise you to retain counsel of your own, as the matter of the forged documents and the misappropriated funds may well proceed to criminal proceedings, depending on what further investigation reveals. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, her carefully maintained composure finally, completely gone, replaced by something raw and frightened that Eliza had never once seen in 3 years of living beneath her control. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What will become of Charlotte? None of this was her doing. She knew nothing of the accounts, nothing of the letters. She is innocent in all of it. Charlotte's innocence is not in question, and nothing in this inquiry threatens her personally, Julian said, and something in his tone softened slightly, enough that Eliza understood he had already considered this concern and found a way to address it without cruelty. Whatever becomes of the arrangements you have made on her behalf, including her betrothal to Baron Coleridge, remains entirely her own choice to pursue, provided it is conducted honestly and without further interference in matters that are not hers to control. It was Mrs. Dobbins, standing quietly near the servants' door with several of the younger staff gathered nervously behind her, who finally stepped forward into the silence that followed, her weathered face set with a determination Eliza had never before seen her display so openly. I would like to offer what I know, if it is wanted, Mrs. Dobbins said, her voice trembling slightly but carrying clearly across the hall. I have served this household for 11 years, since before the master's passing, and I have watched things happen in this house that I was too frightened to speak of, for fear of losing my position, or worse. I have seen Miss Eliza's letters taken from the post before she ever saw them. I have seen her meals reduced when the mistress was displeased with her, and her fires left unlit in winter as punishment for some small defiance. I have heard the mistress instruct the staff, more than once, never to speak of Miss Eliza to visitors, never to mention her name, as though she did not exist at all within these walls. One by one, emboldened by Mrs. Dobbins's courage, 2 of the younger maids stepped forward as well, offering their own quiet, halting accounts of small cruelties witnessed and never reported, of instructions given to keep Eliza unseen and unheard, of a household run for 3 years on a foundation of careful, deliberate erasure. Magistrate Ellery listened to each account with grave attention, noting names and details in a small leather book he produced from his coat, and when the last maid had finished speaking, he turned back to Margaret with an expression that offered no further room for denial. I believe, Mrs. Whitmore, that the inquiry I mentioned will proceed a great deal more swiftly than either of us initially anticipated. Margaret did not answer. She stood very still in the center of her own entrance hall, surrounded by servants who had finally found the courage to speak the truth they had witnessed for years, by a solicitor holding proof of her theft, by a magistrate prepared to strip away every scrap of authority she had spent 3 years so carefully building, and by the stepdaughter she had tried so hard to erase, now standing straight and steady before her, no longer silent, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. For the first time since her father's death, Eliza Whitmore stood in the full light of her own home, and no one moved to send her back into the shadows. Magistrate Ellery, satisfied for the moment that the immediate matter of guardianship had been resolved, gave instructions that Margaret was to remain at Ravenswick pending the formal inquiry, though her authority over the household accounts and over Eliza's affairs was suspended effective immediately, to be managed instead by Caro himself in his capacity as the estate's solicitor, until a permanent arrangement could be settled by the court. Margaret received the instruction with a stiff, silent nod, all the fight gone out of her posture, and retreated upstairs without another word, followed by a wide-eyed Charlotte, who had arrived partway through the confrontation, and stood now looking between her mother and Eliza, with an expression of such genuine bewildered shock, that Eliza felt, despite everything, a flicker of sympathy for her. "I did not know," Charlotte said quietly, catching Eliza's arm before she could follow the others upstairs. "Eliza, I swear to you, I did not know any of it. I believed what she told me, about your nerves, about needing quiet and rest. I never once thought to question it." "I know," Eliza said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "You were a child when it began, Charlotte, raised inside a lie you had no reason to doubt. I do not blame you for believing what you were told." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the two young women who had lived under the same roof for 3 years as virtual strangers stood in unfamiliar, tentative understanding, the beginning, perhaps, of something that might yet grow into real sisterhood, once the wreckage of Margaret's deception had finally settled. Julian did not linger long after the household began to sort itself into its new, uncertain order, sensing that Eliza had a great deal to absorb and little need of an audience while she did so. But before he took his leave, he found a quiet moment alone with her near the front steps, away from the servants still murmuring in astonished clusters throughout the hall. "It is not finished," he said gently. "There will be a formal inquiry, and it may take some weeks to fully settle every matter of the accounts and the guardianship. But you are safe now, Eliza. Whatever else remains to be resolved, no one will lock you away again." "I do not know how to thank you for what you have done," Eliza said, her voice unsteady, with an emotion too large and too new to name easily. "You have given me back a life I had nearly stopped believing I would ever have." "You do not owe me thanks," Julian said quietly. "You owe me nothing at all. What I did because it was right, and because I could not, having once seen the truth of your situation, simply look away from it." He hesitated, then added, with a warmth that had nothing to do with the careful diplomacy of a duke, and everything to do with the simple honesty of a man speaking to a woman he had come, in the space of little more than a week, to care for a great deal. "Though I confess, Eliza, I find that I am in no hurry at all to see the last of you, now that matters here are finally set right. If you would permit it, I should like very much to remain in this county a while longer yet." Eliza looked up at him, at the man who had fallen so unexpectedly over her garden wall and, in doing so, had torn down every other wall that had kept her hidden for 3 long years. And for the first time since her father's death, she smiled without any careful calculation of who might be watching, without any fear of what the smile might cost her. "I should like that very much," she said. 6 weeks later, Eliza Whitmore stood before a full-length mirror, in a gown of deep gold silk, watching a stranger's reflection stare back at her, and slowly coming to understand that the stranger was herself. The weeks between Margaret's downfall and this evening had passed in a manner so different from the slow, silent years before them, that Eliza sometimes found herself waking in the mornings almost disbelieving her own good fortune, half expecting to hear Margaret's sharp knock at her door, half expecting to discover it had all been some elaborate, cruel dream from which she would soon be forced to wake. But each morning brought fresh proof that it was real. Letters arrived for her now, addressed openly, delivered directly into her own hands rather than intercepted and read by someone else first. She walked the front lawns whenever she pleased, in full view of the drive, no longer confined to the hidden paths of the overgrown southern garden. She dined at the head of her own table, in her father's old chair, which Caro had gently but firmly insisted was rightfully hers to occupy, now that the estate's true ownership had been restored to proper order. Caro himself had proven a steady, patient guide through the tangled business of settling the estate's accounts, visiting Ravenswick twice more in the weeks following the inquiry, to walk Eliza through every ledger and document that concerned her inheritance, patiently explaining terms and figures she had never once been permitted to understand before, until she found herself capable of managing her own affairs with a competence that surprised even her. It was, she often thought, the strangest kind of freedom, to discover not only that she was safe, but that she was capable, that the frightened, silenced girl Margaret had shaped over 3 years of careful cruelty had never been the whole truth of who Eliza Whitmore actually was. Julian visited often during those weeks as well, though always with scrupulous propriety, never overstepping the careful boundaries that still governed a young unmarried woman's reputation, however remarkable the circumstances of their acquaintance had been. He brought books from his own extensive library, knowing her fondness for reading long confined to whatever few volumes Margaret had grudgingly allowed her. He walked with her in the restored gardens, listening with genuine interest as she spoke, haltingly at first and then with growing confidence, of small hopes and opinions she had never before been permitted to voice aloud to anyone. Slowly, patiently, without ever pressing her faster than she was ready to go, he had helped her rebuild not only her freedom but her sense of her own voice, her own worth, separate entirely from whatever value Margaret had once tried to erase or claim for herself. The inquiry Magistrate Ellery had opened concluded far more swiftly than anyone at Ravenswick had dared hope, aided considerably by Margaret's own solicitor, who, upon reviewing the mounting evidence against his client, had quietly advised her that contesting the findings would only worsen whatever consequences the court eventually decided upon. Margaret had not been sent to prison, in the end, a mercy Eliza herself had requested of the magistrate, not out of any tenderness toward the woman who had stolen 3 years of her life, but out of a simple, weary desire to be finished with the whole ugly business as quickly and quietly as possible, and out of consideration for Charlotte, who had suffered enough disruption to her own happiness without the additional weight of a public scandal. Instead, Margaret had been required to repay every shilling that could be traced and accounted for, stripped permanently of any authority over the estate, and left to live out her remaining years on a modest allowance in a small house some distance from the county, far enough that the two women were unlikely to cross paths again, except by deliberate choice. Charlotte had chosen differently. Her betrothal to Baron Coleridge, once confirmed to have proceeded honestly and without any hidden manipulation on Margaret's part, had gone forward as planned, and the wedding, held quietly at the parish church just 3 weeks after the inquiry concluded, had been attended by nearly the entire county, curious to witness for themselves the aftermath of the scandal that had consumed every dinner conversation for a month. Eliza had stood beside Charlotte throughout the ceremony, no longer a hidden, forgotten stepsister but a guest of honor in her own right, and the two young women, drawn closer by shared hardship rather than divided by it, had wept together afterward in a manner that suggested the beginning of a genuine, lasting friendship neither had expected to find. And now, tonight, Eliza stood preparing for her own formal presentation to society, a proper introduction at the very same Hartfield Assembly Hall where, 6 weeks earlier, Charlotte alone had been meant to shine, while Eliza remained locked away and forgotten in her room at Ravenswick. "You look beautiful, Miss Eliza." The young maid assisting with her hair, a girl named Lucy who had only recently joined the household staff and knew nothing of the old fear that had once governed every corner of Ravenswick, beamed with genuine, uncomplicated pleasure as she fastened the final pin into place. "I have never seen a gown so fine." "Thank you, Lucy." Eliza studied her reflection a moment longer, turning slightly to watch the gold silk catch the candlelight, remembering, with a pang that was no longer quite so sharp as it had once been, the gray, ill-fitting dresses she had worn for 3 years, chosen deliberately, she understood now, to make her as unremarkable and forgettable as possible. Tonight's gown had been chosen entirely by her own hand, from her own funds, restored to her at last under Caro's careful, honest management, and the difference felt, in some small but profound way, like the truest measure of everything that had changed. Mrs. Dobbins appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, dressed in her own best clothes for the occasion, since Eliza had insisted, over the housekeeper's flustered protests, that she attend the assembly as a guest rather than remain behind with the other staff. "The carriage is ready, Miss Eliza, whenever you are." "I am ready." Eliza rose from the dressing table, smoothing the gold silk with hands that trembled only slightly, more from anticipation than fear now, an entirely different kind of trembling than she had known in this house for years. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbins, for everything. I do not know that I would have survived these past years at all, if not for your quiet kindness. You survived them because you are stronger than you ever gave yourself credit for," Mrs. Dobbins said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I only left a door unbolted now and then. You did the rest yourself. The assembly hall, when Eliza's carriage finally drew up before it, blazed with candlelight and music, carriages lining the drive in numbers she had never witnessed even from her narrow bedroom window. And for a moment, stepping down onto the gravel in her fine gold gown, Eliza felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink back, to retreat into shadow and silence, rather than step forward into so much light and attention. But then she saw Julian waiting near the entrance, dressed in formal evening clothes, his expression brightening the moment he caught sight of her, and the old instinct dissolved as quickly as it had risen.
"You are staring,"
Eliza said, a little breathless, as he crossed to meet her.
"I am allowed to stare. You are extraordinary."
Julian offered his arm and Eliza took it, feeling the eyes of the assembled county turn toward them as they entered the hall together, whispers rising and falling in her wake, though for the first time in her life, the whispers held nothing of scorn or suspicion, only curious, admiring interest in the young woman who had survived so remarkable and public a scandal with her head held high. The evening passed in a blur of introductions Eliza had never before been permitted to receive, of dances she had never before been allowed to join, of conversations with neighbors who had, only weeks earlier, believed her too fragile of nerve to leave her room, now eager to make her acquaintance and hear, in whatever careful, edited version she chose to share, the story of her long confinement and its dramatic end. She found she did not mind the attention nearly as much as she had feared she might. There was a particular freedom, she discovered, in being seen at last, in having her existence acknowledged openly, rather than whispered about and explained away. Charlotte herself, radiant in her new role as Baroness Coleridge, found Eliza during a lull in the dancing and drew her toward a quiet corner away from the crowd, her expression a mixture of joy and lingering guilt that had not entirely faded in the weeks since the inquiry. "I still think of it sometimes," Charlotte admitted quietly. "How close I came to living my whole life, never knowing the truth of what happened to you, never once asking the questions I should have asked years ago. I do not know how you can look at me at all without resentment. Because you were as trapped by her lies as I was, in your own way," Eliza said gently, taking her stepsister's hand. "You simply did not know the walls were there. I have decided, Charlotte, that I would rather spend my strength building something new with you than punishing you for a cage neither of us built." Charlotte's eyes glistened, and she embraced Eliza warmly before the Baron claimed her for the next dance, and Eliza, watching them go, felt something settle quietly into place in her chest, an old wound finally beginning, in earnest, to heal. Colonel Pierce, the very gentleman Margaret had once hoped to see paired with Charlotte, approached midway through the evening to request a dance, and Eliza, glancing briefly at Julian, who inclined his head with an amused, entirely unjealous smile, accepted with genuine pleasure, delighting in the simple, ordinary joy of moving through a set of steps she had only ever practiced alone in her room, imagining a partner who did not exist. It was near midnight when the musicians paused for a brief rest, and the hall filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of refreshments being served, that Julian found Eliza again near one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit grounds, and drew her gently aside from the thickest part of the crowd. "I have a question for you," he said, and something in his voice, quieter and more serious than his usual easy warmth, made Eliza's pulse quicken with an anticipation she could not quite name. "Not tonight, perhaps, since I would not wish to overshadow your own evening with any announcement of mine. But soon, Eliza, I intend to ask you something rather important, and I wanted you to have some warning of it, so that it does not come as a complete surprise when the moment arrives." "You are being terribly mysterious," Eliza said, though her heart had already begun to guess at his meaning, warmth spreading through her chest at the mere suggestion of it. "I am a duke, Eliza. We are permitted a certain amount of mystery." His smile faded into something more earnest as he took her hand, right there beside the tall window, careless of who might observe them. "I have spent a great deal of my life avoiding entanglements, avoiding anyone who wanted something from my title rather than from me. And then I fell over a garden wall, quite by accident, and found the one person in all of England who never once asked me for anything at all, who offered kindness and courage and trust to a stranger before she ever knew what that stranger's name was worth. I do not intend to let that go, Eliza, now that I have found it." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, happy ones this time, entirely unlike the tears she had wept so often in her small, locked-away room. "I never wanted your title, Julian. I only ever wanted to be seen, to matter to someone simply as myself." "You have always mattered," Julian said softly, "simply as yourself. That was never in question, not from the very first morning I saw you in that garden." Across the hall, the musicians began to gather again for the next set, and the warm glow of candlelight caught the gold of Eliza's gown as she stood beside the window with the man who had torn down every wall that had once kept her hidden. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt entirely, wholly free, not merely from the prison Margaret had built around her, but from the fear that had convinced her, for 3 long years, that she deserved nothing more than silence and shadow. Near the far edge of the hall, watching from a modest distance in the plain, unremarkable dress her reduced circumstances now required, Margaret Whitmore observed the scene with an expression no one troubled themselves to notice or interpret. She had been permitted to attend the assembly only as a courtesy extended by Charlotte, who could not quite bring herself to exclude her own mother entirely from her wedding celebrations, whatever Margaret's crimes. She watched Eliza laugh at something Julian said, watched the easy warmth between them, watched the county's most eligible women whispering not in scorn but in envy at the young woman who had once been kept so carefully out of sight, and understood, with a bitterness that offered no comfort at all, exactly what she had lost in her long, desperate effort to keep it from someone else. Eliza did not look toward her once, all evening. She had no more silence left to spend on Margaret Whitmore, no more careful, watchful attention to give a woman who had taken 3 years of her life, and very nearly taken everything else besides. Tonight belonged entirely to herself, to the future stretching out before her at last, wide open and unguarded, exactly as it always should have been. Later, as her carriage carried her home beneath a wide, star-scattered sky, Eliza rested her head against the window and thought back over the whole strange, remarkable turn her life had taken since the morning a stranger fell over her garden wall. She thought of the girl she had been then, listening for footsteps in the dark, memorizing the paths of a hidden garden because it was the only freedom she had ever been allowed. That girl felt, tonight, like someone from a story she had once read long ago, distant and a little unreal, though Eliza knew she would carry pieces of her always, the caution, the quiet strength, the stubborn refusal to disappear entirely even when the whole of her world had conspired to make her invisible. Mrs. Dobbins, riding home in the carriage behind her own modest, borrowed finery, would tell the other staff for years afterward that she had never seen a young woman transformed so completely as Eliza Whitmore in those weeks between her stepmother's disgrace and her formal return to society, and that whenever asked how such a transformation had been possible, she gave always the same simple answer. Miss Eliza had never truly needed transforming at all. She had only ever needed the chance to be seen. Eliza fell asleep that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without once listening for footsteps in the hallway, without once bracing herself against the small, familiar fears that had governed her every waking hour for 3 long years. She slept instead with the memory of candlelight and music and Julian's quiet, earnest promise still warm in her chest, and dreamed, for once, not of the past she had survived, but of the future finally, fully hers to claim. Spring came early to Ravendale that year, and with it came the letter Eliza had, in her heart, been waiting for since the night of the assembly, though it arrived in a manner far less formal than she had expected. She was in the garden, her own garden now, no longer hidden or overgrown but tended properly at last, when Julian arrived unannounced one bright morning, dismounting from his horse at the edge of the drive and crossing the lawn toward her, with a purposefulness that made her set down her shears immediately, her heart already quickening at the sight of his face. "You look as though you have news," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, entirely unconcerned with appearing anything less than perfectly composed for a duke, a habit she had long since abandoned in his company. "I do, though it is not the news I intend to deliver this morning." Julian reached her and took both her hands in his expression carrying none of his usual easy humor, replaced instead by something far more solemn and certain. "I have spoken with Caro, and with your own wishes in mind, and I find I can wait no longer to ask you properly what I have wanted to ask since the night of the assembly, and if I am honest, Eliza, since a great deal longer than that." Eliza's breath caught, and she said nothing, only waited, her hands trembling slightly within his. "I do not have a garden wall to fall over this time," Julian said, a faint, nervous smile finally breaking through his solemnity. "So I am afraid you will have to accept a rather more conventional proposal. Eliza Whitmore, you found me broken and uninvited in your garden, and instead of turning me away, you gave me shelter and kindness, and eventually, without either of us quite intending it, you gave me a reason to believe that the life I had built for myself, careful and guarded and entirely alone, was not the only life available to me. I love you, not for what you survived, though I admire that more than I can easily say, but for who you are beneath it, brave and clever and endlessly kind, even after everything that was taken from you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Eliza could not speak at all, 3 years of learned silence rising briefly even now, in this moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, before she pushed through it entirely, the way she had learned, slowly and painfully, to push through every wall Margaret had ever built around her. "Yes," she said, and then, laughing through sudden tears, said it again, more firmly. "Yes, Julian. Of course, yes." He kissed her then, gently, in the bright spring sunlight of the garden that had once been her only freedom, and was now simply one small, beloved corner of a life that belonged entirely and openly to her. And somewhere behind them, from an upstairs window, Mrs. Dobbins watched the whole scene unfold with tears of her own, already planning, with quiet, practical efficiency, exactly how she would organize the household for the wedding to come. The engagement was announced within the week, and the county, still recovering from the scandal of Margaret's disgrace, found itself with an entirely new and far more welcome subject for gossip and speculation. The Duke of Ravendale, long considered the most elusive bachelor in England, had chosen for his bride not a wealthy London heiress or a fashionable society favorite, but a quiet, remarkable young woman from their own county, whose story of survival and quiet courage had already begun to soften, in retelling after retelling, into something closer to legend than mere local scandal. Charlotte insisted on helping plan every detail of the wedding, throwing herself into the task with an enthusiasm that spoke as much of her own genuine happiness for Eliza as of her natural love of celebration, and the two stepsisters spent long afternoons together in the weeks that followed, poring over fabric samples and flower arrangements, laughing over small disagreements about ribbon colors, building, quietly and steadily, the sisterhood that Margaret's long deception had denied them both for so many years. Margaret herself was not invited to the wedding. Eliza had considered it in the end, weighing forgiveness against the deep, lingering wounds 3 years of confinement had left behind, and had decided, with Julian's quiet support, and without any real bitterness left to fuel the decision, that some doors, once closed, were better left closed, not out of cruelty, but out of a simple, hard-won understanding that her own peace mattered more than any performance of reconciliation the county might have expected of her. She sent Margaret a brief civil letter instead, informing her of the engagement and wishing her well in her reduced circumstances, and received in reply a short note that offered, for the first time in Eliza's memory, something that almost resembled genuine regret. It was not forgiveness, not entirely, not yet. But it was, perhaps, a beginning, and Eliza found she could let it rest there, unresolved but no longer poisonous, a small loose thread in an otherwise finished and beautiful tapestry. The wedding itself took place on a clear morning in early summer, in the same parish church where Charlotte had married her baron months before, the pews filled with neighbors who had once believed Eliza too fragile of nerve to be seen, now gathered eagerly to witness her marry the most sought-after duke in England. Eliza wore ivory silk trimmed with her mother's old lace, carefully preserved through 3 years of confinement in the small hidden collection beneath her floorboard, a final, fitting tribute to the parents who had loved her before the world had tried so hard to make her disappear. As she walked down the aisle toward Julian, past faces that had once looked through her as though she did not exist, and now watched her with open warmth and admiration, Eliza thought of the frightened, silent girl who had once listened for footsteps in the dark, who had memorized every hidden path of an overgrown garden because it was the only freedom available to her, who had believed, for 3 long years, that she had been forgotten entirely by the world beyond her locked bedroom door. That girl had been wrong. She had never truly been forgotten. She had only been waiting, patiently and courageously, for someone willing to climb over the wall that kept her hidden, and to see, at last, exactly who she had always been. Julian took her hands at the altar, his eyes bright with a happiness that mirrored her own, and as the vicar began the ceremony that would bind their lives together, Eliza felt, for the first time since her father's death, a peace so complete and so certain that she knew, without any doubt at all, that whatever silence and shadow had once defined her life, they belonged now entirely to the past. The wedding breakfast that followed stretched long into the afternoon, held on the wide lawns of Ravendale's own estate under a sky so perfectly blue, it seemed almost designed for the occasion, and Eliza found herself, more than once, simply pausing amid the celebration, to look around at the life spread out before her, half disbelieving still that it belonged to her at all. She danced with Julian beneath strings of lanterns as the afternoon faded into evening, and with Colonel Pierce, who had become a genuine friend in the months since the assembly, and with the Baron, whose easy laughter had become a familiar and welcome sound at every gathering that included Charlotte. She danced too with Mr. Caro, who had traveled from London specially for the occasion and who confessed, with uncharacteristic sentiment for so precise a man, that he had rarely felt so satisfied by the successful conclusion of any matter in his long career, as he did watching Eliza married and settled at last. Mrs. Dobbins, seated at a place of honor near the head table, an arrangement Eliza had insisted upon over the older woman's flustered protests that a housekeeper had no business dining among such fine company, wept openly through most of the ceremony and much of the celebration afterward. Accepting the good-natured teasing of the other guests with a watery laugh and the simple explanation that she had known Miss Eliza since she was a girl of 17, frightened and alone in a house that had tried very hard to make her disappear, and that she had never once, in all those difficult years, stopped believing that someday, somehow, things would come right for her. As the sun began to set and the first stars appeared above the lawns, Julian found Eliza again near the edge of the gathering, away from the music and the laughter, and drew her gently into the quiet of the garden path that wound toward the old orchard, not so different, in its shape and its stillness, from the garden where they had first met. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, his arm around her waist as they walked. "Only that it took so long to reach this moment," Eliza said, resting her head against his shoulder. "But perhaps it needed to happen exactly as it did. Perhaps I needed those 3 years, hard as they were, to understand fully what freedom actually meant, so that I would never again take it for granted once I finally had it. A generous way to think of it. I have had a great deal of practice finding generosity where I might once have found only bitterness. It is, I think, the one gift Margaret unintentionally gave me, though I doubt she would appreciate being thanked for it." Eliza laughed softly, and Julian laughed with her, the sound warm and easy in the gathering dusk. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, past the orchard trees now heavy with early summer fruit, until they reached a small stone bench Julian had ordered placed there only weeks before, in the exact spot, he confessed, where he had first climbed over her garden wall and landed, bruised and startled, at her feet. "I thought it fitting," he said, "to mark the place somehow. It seemed, after all, the beginning of everything that mattered most in my life." Eliza sat beside him on the bench, watching the last light fade gently over the orchard, and felt, for the first time in longer than memory, entirely and completely at peace. The girl who had once knelt in this very spot, drawn by curiosity toward a stranger's cry of pain on the other side of a high stone wall, could never have imagined the life that single moment of courage would eventually lead her toward. But she was grateful, endlessly and quietly grateful, that she had chosen, on that gray morning 3 years into her confinement, to walk toward the sound instead of away from it. Ahead of her stretched only light, and freedom, and a future she had fought, in her own quiet way, so very hard to claim.